One of the reasons that the pelvic structures are so very important is for the possibility of childbearing. So the pelvis, the general term, is really formed by the hip bone, sacrum, and the coccyx. But remember that the hip bones are part of the appendicular skeleton, but the sacrum and the coccyx are part of the axial skeleton. It's a very important differentiation to know. Female pelvises tend to be wider, shallower, lighter, and rounder than male pelvises. Is, of course, to be adapted for the possibility of childbearing. So, when we look at the pelvis, we look at the pelvic brim, and the pelvic brim is going to define the pelvic inlet. It's a continuous oval ridge that runs from the pelvic crest through the arcuate line and the sacral promontory. So it separates the false pelvis. The false pelvis would be superior to the pelvic brim, whereas the true pelvis is inferior to the pelvic brim and literally defines the birth canal. So the true pelvis is shown here, and the pelvic outlet itself is bounded by the pubic arch, the ischia, the sacrum, and the coccyx. So the pelvic outlet is inferior, the inferior margin of the true pelvis. When we compare the male and the female, this chart shows us some of the significant differences. So for the female, the pelvis is tilted forward, adapted for childbearing. The true pelvis defines the extent of the birth canal, and the bone thickness is less, lighter, thinner, and smoother. The acetabulum are smaller and farther apart, and the pubic arch or subpubic angle is broader or closer to a right angle. Whereas in the male pelvis is tilted far forward, adapted for support of a male's heavier build and stronger muscles. And the cavity of the true pelvis is narrow and deep. The bone thickness is greater for the male, heavier and thicker, and the markings are much more prominent. So you'll be able to feel those if you go into a SBC learning support center where the bones are located at. The acetabula, those depressions for the head of the femur, are larger and much closer together, and the angle for the pubic arch is much more acute, between 50 to 60 degrees. We can see the acetabulum and their differences, and the pelvic brim is also shown right here. Looking at this part of the chart in the next row, we see the difference in the sacrum. For the female, it's much wider, shorter, and there's less of a sacral curvature. For the male, it's narrow, longer, and there's more of a sacral curvature. So you can see a little bit of a difference here versus here. The coccyx itself would be more movable and projects inferiorly for the female, whereas it's less movable and projects anteriorly for the male. The greater sciatic notch is wide and shallow in the female and narrow and deep for the male. For the pelvic inlet or brim, it's wider and oval from side to side for childbearing, and it's basically heart-shaped for the male. So if you kind of look here, it kind of looks like a heart. For the pelvic outlet, it's wider. The ischial spines are further apart for the birth canal, but certainly narrower, and the ischial spines are closer together for the male. So now we're going to continue with the lower limb. And the lower limb, of course, carries the entire weight of the erect body. So it's subjected to exceptional forces during jumping and running. And its three segments are the thigh, the leg, and the foot. The thigh is going to begin with the femur, which is the largest and strongest bone in the body, making up about 1/4 of one person's height. So, for example, in a lab, it is possible to measure the length of a femur and sort of see or estimate the height of that person. It articulates proximally with the acetabulum of the hip and distally with the tibia and patella. The patella is the main sesamoid bone in the quadriceps tendon. And remember, we're classifying the patella as a short bone. Some of the important parts of the femur are the greater and lesser trochanters, the gluteal tuberosity. Again, a tuberosity is a point of attachment for a muscle. The distal ends are the lateral and medial condyles, medial and lateral epicondyles, and the patellar surface, which we see on this slide. So as we zoom in a little bit here, we're looking at the proximal end of the femur with the head that articulates with the deep acetabulum. On the lateral side of the head is the greater trochanter, and the medial side is the lesser trochanter. There is a gluteal tuberosity where the gluteal muscles, these are the muscles in your butt, the gluteal muscles are attached. So you've seen several examples, or you will, of tuberosities. Moving down to the distal end of the femur, looking at an anterior and posterior view, we first see the patellar surface, which will, of course, articulate with the patella. The condyles, so there's the medial condyle and the lateral condyle. And then on top of the condyles are epicondyles. We have the medial epicondyle and the lateral epicondyle. So you should be able to look at a femur and based on the condyles and the head of the femur, be able to identify whether it's a right or left femur. For the patella, the kneecap, there's really not much to know about it besides the fact that it is a sesamoid bone, which is a type of short bone. The leg region is composed of two parallel bones, the tibia and the fibula. The tibia is the more medial bone that receives the weight of the body from the femur, and it has medial and lateral condyles, as well as a tibial tuberosity and a medial malleolus. The tibial tuberosity is the point of attachment for another muscle called the tibialis anterior, which you'll be learning about later in the semester. The fibula has no weight bearing. Several muscles do originate from it. And at the proximal end, it has a head. At the distal end, it has a lateral malleolus. So when we look at the tibia, if we zoom in here, we can see the medial condyle and the lateral condyle at the proximal end, the head of the fibula, tibial tuberosity, where that muscle attaches. As we scroll down to the distal end of these two bones, the lateral malleolus is on the fibula. So if you put your hand on your ankle on the outside, that ball of the ankle is actually the lateral malleolus. So it's really not the ankle bone, it's the fibula. Also, if you put your hand on the inside of your ankle on the medial side, that region where you feel the sort of that bump is the medial malleolus for the tibia. So this shows the proximal views of the tibia. We can see the lateral condyle, the tibial tuberosity. And on the posterior view here, we can see the lateral condyle as well.